Good evening. My name is Bob McDonough. I'm from Oliphant originally. I now presently live in Jessup. And for the past 20-some years, I've been doing research on mainly Oliphant and a priest by the name of Father Murphy. He served there for 40 years. And while I was doing that, I came across many articles on John Mitchell and, of course, the strike of 1902. One of the things that amazed me was that every time I went to look for more stuff, everybody was repeating the same things about John, which is true, but I was trying to figure out what did he have that made him overcome the 6 major obstacles that he faced in that strike. And of course, the first obstacle would be the nationality difference. Different cultures, different religions, different nationalities, different ways of life. Second part of that first question would be the anthracite field itself was different. It wasn't just one anthracite field. It was a mindset of 3 or 4 anthracite fields. And he had to overcome that obstacle. The second obstacle he had to overcome was, of course, the religious obstacle. Prior to 1900, 1902, most of the time, the religious leaders, most of them Catholic, and many Presbyterian or Methodists, were not necessarily anti-union, but they weren't pro-union either. So what they would do is just cater to the owners. The third obstacle Mr. Mitchell had to overcome is when he started the strike of 1900, he would have to win that strike. If he had lost that strike, he would have a problem. The fourth obstacle Mr. Mitchell had to overcome was, of course, the speech at the Indianapolis Convention trying to get the bituminous miners to stay on the job and honor their contract while the anthracite miners went on strike. And if he failed to do that, then, of course, that would be used against him, saying that they don't honor their strikes. The fifth obstacle is, of course, his meeting with the president and the operators at the conference in the White House, and that was a very big obstacle. And the last obstacle, of course, would be the hearings themselves. He would have to be very calm, collective. He would have to show he had knowledge of the anthracite business. He would have to show that he understood it and that his arguments were legitimate. So let's start with John Mitchell coming east. John Mitchell, of course, was born in Illinois, and he was raised in Illinois. He was a miner. When he was young, he had to go into the mines, recover the bodies. So when he was doing that, he understood basically how difficult it was safety-wise in the mines. So when he became older and joined the unions and started organizing, his main thought was to improve wages and to increase safety for the miners. And during the bituminous strike or conference or contract in 1897, John Mitchell was an organizer, secretary, treasurer in the state of Illinois. Now, in the state of Illinois, he was very good at that. So when the bituminous miners signed their contract in 1897, he was awarded a position higher up. And that position became vice president under Thomas Ratchford of the United Mine Workers Union. Okay? Thomas Ratchford, in the middle of 1898, decides he's going to go to another business. He's been offered jobs, and he decides he's leaving, and John Mitchell is promoted from vice president to president, although he's not elected on his own. In 1899, he will be elected on his own. And in 1899, he will become the head of the United Mine Workers of America. He wants to organize the anthracite miners into a strong union in which they would be able to increase their wages, improve their safety conditions, and help alleviate some of the pain that they had. He would come east out of Illinois, the same as Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, of course, came east. Grant was famous, had 3 victories over the Confederate rebels. Mitchell had no such victories, so he didn't have that. Grant had an enemy that was dying, and they were on the downplay, where Mitchell's was at peak strength. His enemy was not somebody that you would think was very appreciative of the miners or people who were, let's say, poor. Okay, and I have a thing here I was going to read. But so he comes east, and he starts to organize. Mother Jones, excuse me, comes east also. She's organizing the. He travels from Pottsville to Forest City. I don't think there's a town that he missed. If you check the papers of the day, multiple times he's in different areas. He's everywhere for a year. Him and Mother Jones and organizers. So how does he treat the nationality problem? Well, one of the things he has to do when he treats the nationality problem is he has to have interpreters, because not everybody speaks English. Okay? So everywhere he goes, he makes sure that he has an interpreter for the individuals that he's going to speak to. That helps a lot because people like to be spoken to in their native tongue, especially immigrants. Immigrants have one thing in common. They all have hope, and hope for a better life. And that's why they came to America, because they weren't getting a better life in the old world. So they came and they wanted a better life, but unfortunately they weren't as accepted as they should have been. Whether you start with the Irish, and you go to the Italians, to the Slovaks, to the Russians, you know, all the way down. It's the same for everybody. And so Mitchell has to approach them in a way that is, let's say, where he's sincere. He shows a sincerity to them. Now, sincerity is a tough thing to show. You know after the fact if a person's been sincere, but before the fact, you really don't know that. Some of the words used to describe John Mitchell were just, conservative, honorable, law-abiding, law-loving, prudent, honest, practical, progressive, listens, confident, knowledgeable, God-fearing. Well, God-fearing, I always like that word, God-fearing, because, you know, I don't know, should I fear God or shouldn't I? You know, is that what that means? No, it doesn't. But when you're growing up, you think, oh, God-fearing. I don't know. But what did John Mitchell give that the young miners understood in these nationalities and cultures and churches? One of the things is he treated them as an equal. And they hadn't been treated as an equal in the old country. And for the most part, they hadn't been treated as an equal in this country. But he treated them as an equal. And I found this in one book. I can't remember where I found it. But it was to give every miner and their family the dignity to which they are entitled for being part of humanity. And that's what John Mitchell did. He talked to these people like they were real people. He gave them the ability to look to themselves and say, yeah, I'm somebody. So they took to that. They absorbed that, and they decided that they would become a supporter of his. So as he went up and down the valley doing this, and his interpreters, they were starting to grow, and they started to believe him, which was one of the first obstacles he had to overcome. The second part of that first one, of course, is the mine. Anthracite mining is a 500 square mile area, but it has different sections. And the southern section is not the same as the northern section. East, west, they're different. And they're based on a canal system. So if you're down in Schuylkill County and the canals were the first way to ship coal to market, your mindset is towards Philadelphia. If you're in Carbon County and you ship mines on the Lehigh Canal down towards the Delaware River and into Philly and southern Jersey, you're a little bit different mindset. And if you're over on the other side, again, it's a little different mindset. The D&H canal system, of course, was for the northern field, and that shipment was to New York. So the mindset of the people in Lackawanna and northern Luzerne County is New York City. So over the years, this develops this mindset, and it becomes different. And I don't know if anybody ever worked in the southern field down there in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, but they think differently, even today. You go to Wilkes-Barre, it's not the same as if you're in Scranton. Okay, and the same thing goes. And he has to overcome that. The miners used to play, or the owners used to play the miners off against each other, one nationality against another, one religion, one culture, one field against another. So he always had divisions, and where you had divisions, the owners controlled. His idea was to get this one group together and make them a formidable opponent to the owners. Excuse me. And what he did is he was able to mitigate many of the problems and lessen the differences. And they took to that, and they were willing to give him a chance. So if you were to look at that and say obstacle number one, if nothing else, he improved the situation as far as the miners were concerned and their ability to think as one rather than as a dozen different people. The second obstacle he had to overcome was, of course, religion. The religious leaders, basically. And they had to come to the aid of the miners. Well, times were changing. And John Mitchell saw that times were changing. The owners never recognized the changing times. John Mitchell saw that not only were the miners starting to help each other, but the religious people were starting to back the miners. They weren't just paying homage to the owners. They were pushing for miners, and that's one of the big things that they did. So he was able to go from town to town and speak to Father Kern in Wilkes-Barre, Father Comerford in Archibald. He was able to speak to Father Murphy in Oliphant. He was able to speak to Father Phillips in Hazleton, or some others down there, and so he was able to get their backing. And of course, with a new bishop, Bishop Hoban of Scranton, as opposed to Bishop O'Hara, who was more conservative, Bishop Hoban was more progressive, more open-minded, spoke 10 languages, okay? And he started orphanages, schools. So he was ready to adapt. He was ready to go forward. And one of the things that he had was his ability to say to his men, his church people, that they could go ahead and do what they needed to do to bring about the union strength, let's say. Okay, I have I thought I had one here, a statement by him, but he had 3 speeches that he gave. One was in December of '01, Bishop Hoban, and he spoke in favor of a union and told the men to strike like men if they couldn't get a decent wage. Okay. The second one he gave was in March of '02, just before the strike, again telling them basically the same thing. You have a right to be paid decently. You and your families have a right to live decently. So you should back your union leaders. And the third one he gave was the day of the first day of the strike, the temporary strike on May 12th, in which he went out and hoped and prayed that they would be successful in their strike. He doubted a little bit if they could be because the powerful trusts were against him. But he wanted that done. Over the course of this year, he was able to make friends with John Kern in Wilkes-Barre. He was communicating with Bishop Hoban. His secretary treasurer under him was a guy by the name of William Wilson. He was Scottish. He worked the mines out in Arnott, out near Blossburg. He joined the Bituminous Union out there. And he was, just so happens that when he was out there, Father Murphy from Oliphant was out there. And Father Murphy from Oliphant was a big supporter of the union, the Bituminous Union. Okay? Him and Wilson maybe never got together. I could never put them in the same room, but they certainly were supportive of each other. William B. Wilson became the first Secretary of Labor under Woodrow Wilson. When the cabinet was made, he would be that man. And he was John Mitchell's Secretary-Treasurer and worked closely with Mitchell during the strikes. So what we have then is these religious leaders taking on this pro-union facade. We're going to do this, okay? And they spoke about it at Mass. They spoke about it in different places. And then when, in 1892, of course, Rerum Novarum was published by the Vatican on labor and capital and the problems, they, of course, said that they felt that the family deserved to be treated well. And although some people will say that most of the priests in this area did not read that, within months it was being quoted by Father Murphy in Oliphant. It was being quoted by Archbishop, can't think of his name, Cardinal Gibbons in Baltimore, Archbishop, can't think of his name, in Philadelphia. But they were saying the same things. You know, we've got to do something here. This can't just go on, this idea that you're going to be able to run over these people. This industrial age has to take care of the work. So that's what they did. And so Mitchell was able to get that. Now he has some backing of the miners. He has the backing of the church. Now comes 1900, and he decides he needs to call a strike. So what he does is that he offers the owners arbitration. Now, and of course, the owners refuse to even talk to him. So as the days go down and nobody's working, or nobody's helping him out, he decides to call a strike. Now, he only had about 15,000 people signed up as union members in the 1900 strike. So what happens is he knows he's got these listed demands, but will these guys actually go on strike? He's never won a victory before. You know, somebody else ran the show. He didn't. Okay, so now he's worried, I'm going to do this. I hope these guys go on strike. So what happens is he calls for a strike in September of 1900, and not only 15,000, but 50 to 60,000 go on strike. Guys that aren't even members of the union go on strike. And they say, hey, this is a big deal. Okay, so now he's got a little bit more power. Coincidentally, fate intervenes. And you say, well, you know, chance is always chance, but it just happens to be the 1900 presidential election. And William McKinley, who was president, pro-owner, pro-trust, is the president of the United States, running against William Jennings Bryan, who was an agrarian from Nebraska, who was anti-owners, anti-trust, anti-industrial age. So the boys get a little nervous, the Republican Party, because they've always had the presidency, except for Cleveland, since Lincoln. So it's over 55 years. But now, if they flip Pennsylvania to the Democratic Party, along with the Confederacy and the Plains states like Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa, they could lose the presidency. And then you'd have an anti-industrial, anti-capitalist in the White House. So the wheeler-dealer out of Ohio, Senator Marcus Hanna, decides that he will intervene and try to get this thing settled so that it doesn't affect the election of William McKinley. He does intervene. He gets the powers that be, J.P. Morgan, and them, to ask the owners of the railroads, George Bear, Truesdale, Oliphant, those guys, to accept a small increase in wages and some safety conditions. Okay? But they won't accept recognition of the union. And Mitchell's now got to make a decision. Okay, do I go for more? Or do I take the quick victory? And of course, what he does is he takes the quick victory, because he'll have a victory under his belt, it'll look good, plus he gets a wage increase of 10%, which the owners have they're not going to pay it anyway. And he gets safety grievance committees, which the owners might set up or not. Their object is to get the election over with, and then we'll deal with this. So Mitchell takes the 1900 victory. Okay, it's not what he wanted. It's only a partial victory. The Band-Aid approach to what's going to come. But he takes it. He's adaptable. He sees that if he doesn't take it, he could run into real problems. So he takes it. And what happens is he becomes a hero to the miners. over 20 years, they never had a raise. So now all of a sudden they got a raise in a month. Okay, and they've got safety grievance committees. So he's happy. They build they make a holiday for him, John Mitchell Day in 1900, and they celebrate it. So Mitchell's got this victory. Of course, McKinley gets elected. The owners could care less about paying these wage increases or safety things, but they do, some of them. But it's not known until the commission hearings in '02 and '03 that they find out that some of these guys never gave anybody anything. They never lived up to their contract, the owners. But Mitchell's got his victory. He also all of a sudden has 100,000 miners signed up. So he jumps from 15,000 before the strike. With a successful strike, he's now up to 100,000, going on 150, which would have come by 1902. So what he did was, he took the small victory, but because of that, he was able to increase his prestige, and therefore, he was better off. He increased his prestige, and he was a man who didn't believe he did it for himself. He was a man who believed he did it for the miners. It was never about John Mitchell. So the 1900 strike's over, McKinley's elected president, everything's going to go back to normal as far as the owners are concerned. But the 1901, in April, they're supposed to renegotiate the wage increase. So what do? The owners don't need to renegotiate. They're not interested. They're not going to recognize the union. They're not interested in anything. So John Mitchell decides he's better ask for arbitration. So he starts feeling people out, get somebody to talk to him. Nobody will talk to him. None of the owners. They're not going to give an inch. A priest from Hazleton by the name of, and this is just an aside, by the name of Edwards. I think it's that Edward Phillips, Father Phillips, calls or gets in contact with J.P. Morgan, who actually holds most of the stock in these railroads. The railroads own the mines for the most part. And he wants a meeting with him. And the reason I bring this up, because in 1902, a lot of people are going to want to talk to J.P. Morgan because they know he runs the show. And J.P. Morgan is the leading financier in the world. He's overseeing, excuse me, the change in, or the moving of money from England to America. England has no place to put its money. Mitchell is taking it over to America and investing it there in business, his businesses. So he's getting richer. Everybody's happy. The British are richer because they got these investments. Okay, so he's doing that. In 1902, nobody can talk to Pierpont Morgan. They try, but nobody gets to see him. But in 1901, this Father Phillips actually gets to see him. He goes to New York City with members of the Board of Trade, which is his Chamber of Commerce, from Carbondale, Scranton, Hazleton, and Pottsville, I think. One member each, and J.P. Morgan meets them. 15, 20 minutes, that's it. You don't have time for this, it's too important. But he meets them, he listens to them, he says he'll see what he can do. Now, he runs the show, but he's being magnanimous. What can I say? So Phillips and them leave, but at least they got to speak to him. On the side is, a month later, Father Phillips was found dead in an apartment in New York City. He said that he was a heavy drinker and that he went on a bender. Then they said he was with some loose women. Then they said he was in New York for treatment, and that the person who was medically treating him in those days, nobody was licensed. Very few people were licensed. Killed him by accident. New York police picked up a gentleman, they called him a consummate liar and believed that was their man. But I found it kind of odd that the one guy who actually did get to see J.P. Morgan ends up like this. To get back to my story, okay? So it's 1901 again. Mitchell's pushing, and everybody wants it, but nobody wants arbitration. Okay, it's getting closer to 1902, and Mitchell's got to make a decision. Beginning of 1902, the owners come out with a statement in the mines, posted it, saying that the increase that they gave them, supposedly, in 1901 will stay that way until 1903. And then they'll decide in every 6 months whether they want to move it or not. Well, that's unacceptable to the owners or to the miners. So they're pushing Mitchell for a strike. John Mitchell doesn't want to strike. Father Kern in Wilkes-Barre writes a letter to the miners saying that they probably shouldn't strike at this point. And Mitchell doesn't want to strike. There was a little violence in the last strike, and one of the things he promised the religious leaders was that he would cut down on the violence. So what happens is that he gets down into May, and nothing's happened. So he decides he's going to call a temporary strike and then have a meeting in Hazleton with the anthracite miners to see what they want to do. So he calls for a temporary strike on May 12th. On May 14th, they meet in Hazleton, and even though Mitchell is not for a strike, they both strike. So now he's locked in. He's got to go with it. So the strike becomes permanent. Well, this creates another problem. Not only are all these people walking off the mines, 150,000. The mines are shutting down all over. Workers are out of work. One of the big things is now we have the bituminous miners deciding in different groups that they're going to support the anthracite miners by violating their contract. And one of the things I gave you in that pamphlet is the speech of Mitchell at the Indianapolis convention telling them to stay on the job and why they should stay on the job. It's a nice speech. If you read it, I don't think he wrote it himself. I think his ideas are there. I think somebody else might have wrote it for him. But it convinced the miners, the bituminous miners, to stay on the job, honor their contract, while their brothers over in the anthracite field strike. So he overcomes that, and that's his fourth obstacle. He kept them on the job over in the bituminous field while his miners strike. Violence is occurring all over the fields. The military's called in to Shenandoah. Military's called into Oliphant. They're in there with the regiment, 13th Regiment's in Oliphant. And one of the big things is people are starting to get rumbles. One of the things I gave you was an article in the Archibald Citizen, an editorial from the editorial writers of the Archibald Citizen talking about the strike and why the miners deserve better. It's a very good article. If you get a chance, read through it. Some of you may already, since you're from Archibald. I figured maybe you did. But so they go on to that, and Mitchell keeps pushing for arbitration. A lot of people are pushing for arbitration, but nobody wants it. The owners won't even talk. People are trying to meet with different people, doing different things. Curran tries to meet with J.P. Morgan. Morgan goes out of Europe. He's out of Europe on the 5-month strike. He's out of Europe for almost 3 months. Or he's out in Europe for 3 months. He's not here. Bear meets with Curran, but Bear says, look, he's not a miner. It's between us and the miners and nobody else. And that's the way life is. So Mitchell has very little left to do. He's to keep pushing. But winter is coming. Then into September, and it's getting colder in the fall. Price of coal has gone up. A lot of people in Philadelphia and New York are not getting the coal that they need, not only in homes, but in industries, which is a big business problem. So somebody tells Roosevelt, well, McKinley was assassinated in September of '01. Teddy Roosevelt came to the presidency. Okay? Teddy Roosevelt is a progressive. Okay? He comes to the presidency in '01. Roosevelt was Commissioner of Police in New York, Secretary of Navy in the First World War. Not in the First World War, after the Spanish War. Okay? And then they decide, the New York Republican politicians decide that he will make a good governor in New York. So they want him to run for governor because they can control him. And he's governor. So they get him to the governorship and find out they can't control him. So they decide in 1900 that they should run him for vice president because nobody knows who the vice president is, and we'll be rid of him. So that's how he becomes vice president. So he gets elected under McKinley. Of course, McKinley is assassinated in September of '01, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. Fate has intervened again for John Mitchell because now he has a more progressive leader, more forthright. Anyway, Roosevelt's getting a little upset about all of this stuff with the coal and everything else, and the prices going up. So he says to his commissioner of labor, was a guy they had before they had a cabinet post, Carroll Wright, to go and investigate the mining situation and see what we can do. Wright goes and investigates the mining situation. His attorney general tells Roosevelt he cannot interfere by law. He has no right. The commissioner comes back with his report, basically says these people hate each other. This isn't going to work. We have to get these people to sit down together, but we don't know how. Okay? But they just basically hate each other. So Roosevelt says, well, what can we do? Again, Knox, his attorney general, says you can't do anything. You don't have a right to intervene. It's between the miners and the owners. And that's all. Roosevelt doesn't like that answer. So he asked his Secretary of War, Elijah Root. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize later, and so did Elijah Root. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, but not for this. To go to New York and talk to the business leaders and see what they want. So Root goes to New York and says the business leaders and the powers that be in New York want this thing settled, but they don't know how to settle it. So Roosevelt has a meeting with other people, and then he has a party. And after the party, one of his friends comes out and tells the press that Mr. Roosevelt would intervene if asked. If both parties asked him to intervene, then he would. And he let it be known that he would. So, again, the owners say no. They're not interested. So Roosevelt's going on and nothing's happening, and finally he says this is enough. He writes a telegram to all the owners, and you have that in your packet also about the conference, that he wants to meet with them. So the meeting takes place that Friday after the telegram arrives, where all the owners of the railroads, Truesdale, Bear, Markle, different people who own mines, and the union leaders. And what happens is, the day of the meeting, the New York Times publishes an editorial, which I gave you guys in there, and basically, to me, you have to read it yourself, but basically it says that John Mitchell's time isn't worth as much as the owner's time. And although he's at a conference with the president, maybe he shouldn't be there. And the second thing it says is that he's the one that's going to have to not lie. They won't be fooled by tricks. And in the third paragraph it says that he's also responsible for the success of the conference. So basically, you can make your own judgments on that editorial. But it seems to me like they were just saying, look, this guy doesn't belong here. And well, what any way to have the conference? The owners show up, Mitchell shows up. And there is a general report made after the conference that I gave you people. It's in your packet, and you can read it. And basically what it does is Roosevelt invites them in, tell them that he is requesting that they come to terms, not telling them. Okay? He's requesting that they come to terms because he represents a third party in this case, and that's the people. And he has the right to protect their interests. Okay, so what happens is, as soon as he's finished making this statement, Mitchell gets up. Now Mitchell knows that he's willing to arbitrate. He's willing to pick a commission. Mitchell, he could read the papers. Mitchell gets up and says that he would go along with the commission if the president picked the commission, him and his miners would go along with it, and they would gladly go back to work and accept whatever the result is. And the president calls for a break, lunch break, come back, and he wants to hear from the owners. When he comes back, then the owner, George Bear, speaks first, and basically these guys treat the president like he's a pawn. He's supposed to do their bidding. They don't want to hear about this. And so he basically insults him, tells him to do his job, and put these miners back to work. And Truesdale speaks, and these other guys speak. And John Markle speaks, tell him to send in the army, put these guys back on the job, and he has no right to do anything. So then he hears from the Mitchell side again. There was, because one of the owners claimed that the union was responsible for 20 murders, 20 killings. Mitchell says no. He said he knows of 7, and 4 of those were union men. Okay. So he wants an argument back and forth. So then Roosevelt says to the owners, look, will you accept this proposition that Mitchell has agreed to, that reappoint a commission and you have an arbitration? And they said, no, we're not doing it. We're leaving, that's all there is to it. And they leave. Well, word gets out of what happened at the conference, and of course there's a public uproar that the owners are way out of line and this and that. So what they do is they decide, the owners, that things are going to go on as usual. But Roosevelt's not going to let it lie. So what Roosevelt does is tell Root again to go to New York and see Morgan. And he wants this settled. Now Morgan, him and Roosevelt have already had a fight over the Northern Securities Trust. J.P. Morgan and Harriman decided that they were going to put their railroads together and control almost 85% of all the railroads in the country. Roosevelt takes them to court, sues them, and tries to break the trust. So it's in court. So he's already had a fight with them on that. The second thing is, a lot of people are talking about nationalization of the lines. Okay. So Morgan's got to look at this and say, well, do we really need that? So Root's up there, they talk it over. Morgan tells the telegrams, the owners of the railroads, that, look, let's make a deal here. We're going to have a commission. So Morgan runs the show. The owners don't really have a problem. They don't have a say. Word goes back to Roosevelt to have a commission. They name the commission, 5 members, and he calls Mitchell in and tells him, Mitchell says no good. It's only 5 members and there's nobody on there from my side. He said, we can't have this. I want a religious leader on there, and I want a union man on there. And Roosevelt does that. And there's some crazy stuff going on. What do you call the guy? Okay? But Roosevelt basically sets up the commission. And then with that, Mitchell ends the strike. The commissioners will do their job, and they do. The commissioners will meet once, and a couple of weeks later in Washington, and the first big argument is over recognition of the union. They haven't settled that, but whatchamacall says he won't recognize John Mitchell. They're in the same room, they're sitting next to each other. No, but I don't recognize him as the head of the union. I recognize him as a friend of the miners, if you want to put him that way. So that's basically how it comes out. He ends up staying there, okay, as a friend of the miners. So the commission decides that they're going to come to the coal fields, and they're going to investigate before the hearings start. Come to the coal fields. They start up in Forest City and work their way all the way down through Pottsville in different places, and going into the mines, learning all about the business. Some of them had never knew anything about the business, and finding out things they never knew. And so they're happy. They're at the Hotel German, and one of the priests, the man that's a priest, decides he's going to say Mass on Sunday at the cathedral. And all the commission goes to the Mass, and the sermon is about love thy neighbor, love your fellow man, okay? And I got a kick out of that because what a funny way to do things. But anyway, so after that, they have all their investigation done. They set up the hearings for Scranton. They come to Scranton and start their hearings. Under Mitchell, because Mitchell came out of the conference with such a reputation that he proved that he deserved a seat at the table. That he had overcome this conference problem, that he didn't deserve a seat. So now the only thing left for the owners is to try to destroy his reputation. And they will do that by questioning him constantly about different things, and especially about violence. And he will respond. What they find out is that John Mitchell is a very competent, knowledgeable individual, and he's not easily put in a corner. And he goes through the whole thing, 4 days in Scranton. Finally, the commissioner said, look, this is enough on this guy. Let's get on to somebody else. We got all these other witnesses from your side and their side. So they decide that they're going to go on. And while they're doing that, somebody decides they're going to have a side conference and settle this privately. Okay? But the independent owners, who are not always represented there, vote against it because they would have to recognize the union, and they won't recognize a bunch of independent coalmen. So that falls to the wayside. They come back after recess for that in Scranton again, bring Mitchell back on the stand and start up. Then they bring in doctors. They bring in all kinds of miners. And the doctors are one of the most prevalent. One doctor says he did an autopsy on a miner who was dead 10 years. And he said his lungs were black as coal. And one guy said that one guy hadn't worked in the mine 15 years, and when he cut him open, his was black as coal. He said it was just amazing how bad these lungs were on these miners. And these guys testified to that. All of this health problems. The commission takes that. They get down to the end of December, and they adjourn, and they'll come back in Philadelphia in January. And they do that. They come back in Philadelphia in January. And at that point, Mitchell's complaining about some of the miners haven't been put back to work. Although he wants to send them back, the owners won't put them to work. Okay? So he tells the commission this, and the commission doesn't know that. So they're upset about that. There's more haggling back and forth. The owners take the stand and do their thing. One of the problems the owners had is a lot of the numbers they were using were inaccurate and was quickly exposed, which doesn't help your case at all. You know, well, we got numbers here, but they're not right. You know, so it doesn't help. And then, anyway, the commission has already pretty well made up its mind what it's going to do. But now it has the closing testimony of Clarence Darrow, the attorney, and Mr. McVeigh from the owner's side. And the commission ends the hearings. Commission lasted roughly from the beginning. It only lasted a couple of months, 3 months. Cost $50,000. They had their investigation, they had their hearings, they had their report ready and delivered to the president like 78 days or 90 days or something. And it only cost $50,000, of which they had $12,000 left over. Guys knew how to spend money, you know, well and efficiently. Afterwards, one of the biggest problems that John Mitchell had, and I'm going to read this because this is important, was the violence question. He was constantly asked the violence question from the commissioners and from the attorneys, and he could not. He said there wasn't much violence. He said that he couldn't do anything about it, and that the owners were the cause of a lot of it. The owners had hired 1,800 coal police at the beginning of the strike. They also furnished them with weapons. Of course, the miners furnished themselves with weapons. So now you got 3,600, you got all these people with guns, you know what's going to happen, right? Somebody's going to get hurt. There was burnings, it was everything. But this, I just want to read this because this is, as with all strikes in those days, the problem lay not with wages, hours, and working conditions, but also with human dignity. The right to be treated as a human being and not as a commodity, to be used and replaced by another who would be used and replaced, etc. Like worn out parts. The old saying in the anthracite field that the mule was worth more than the miner was literally true to the owners, the operators, the mines, where everything was based on profit and more profit. The miner was more expendable than the mule. This idea that economic pressure and the fear of not making more money gave the operator a reason to treat the miner as less than human and treat him as a tool to be discarded when worn out or broke was an acceptable business practice. This gave the operator a free hand, for without human dignity, there is no right or wrong. They treated the miner as less than a mule, and the operator felt no wrong. They were not at fault even if others viewed this as a sin, but it was a type of violence, pure and simple, even if they refused to acknowledge it. And finally the miner said enough. Some would say there were thousands of acts of violence. Some even claimed calling a person a scab was an act of violence. And one magistrate tried to make it a crime. There were 24 deaths over a 5-month period. 4 were union men, 1 non-union man was accidentally killed by the militia. The others were presumed to be non-union men. There were physical assaults, verbal assaults, intimidations, burnings, and destruction of buildings and general confrontations of all kinds, and not all from one side. But if you looked at a history of strikes, a pattern seems to have developed by which the capitalists used intimidation and violence against the laborers. And after a while, it became acceptable to dehumanize them. Sheriffs, politicians, local authorities, and even the president looked the other way. The capitalists were excused from gain, but there had been violence. In the Great Southwest Strike of 1886, 250,000 workers walked off the job because of a cut in wages, and 10 people died. The Pullman Strike of 94, workers were told they were going to take a 25% cut. And when they revolted, between 5 and 30 died. In the Philadelphia Railroad strike, in 2 days, 40 died. In Philadelphia at the same time, in 2 days, 20 were killed. In Latimer, miners who expressed their right to peacefully assemble were shot and killed, 19 were killed. And no one was held responsible. Just goes to show you that violence was a part of the strike. It's part of the strike because the owners used violence under the guise of law and order, while the miners used violence to try to help themselves. I'm not saying either one was correct, because violence is not correct, but that's how that happened. One more thing, when it was over, I gave you a letter in your pamphlet there about President Roosevelt speaking in Omaha, Nebraska about the commission. I think you should read that, that's very good. But I think Roosevelt's biographer, one of them, said this, and this sums up basically what this was all about. George Bear in the conference at the White House had suggested that if a miner had a problem with his employer, he should seek redress in the Court of Common Pleas of the district where he was employed. The fallacy of this argument was easy to see, as many of the courts, and in many cases the government officials, were nothing more than spokesmen for the wealthy coal operators. Mr. Roosevelt said, The courts had been twisted into the exaltation of property rights over human rights, and the subordination of the welfare of the laborer when compared with the profits of the man for whom he labored. The great coal mining and coal carrying companies, which employed tens of thousands, could easily dispense with the service of any particular miner. A miner, on the other hand, however expert, could not dispense with the companies. He needed a job. His wife and children would starve if he did not get one. What the miner had to sell was his labor. It was a perishable commodity. The labor of today, if not sold today, is lost forever. Moreover, his labor was not, like most commodities, a mere thing. It was part of a living, breathing human being. The worker and all citizens who give thought to the matter saw that the labor problem was not only economic, but also a moral human problem. And I think when you look at the strike of 1902 and you look at John Mitchell, what you have to say is that he approached these obstacles with a morality in mind. He was a decent man. He preferred to treat the miner as a human being and did everything in his power to try to make that happen. And I think he was successful in that part. I'm finished. Anybody have any questions?
Bob, did President Roosevelt visit Oliphant?
Yeah. Well, he visited Oliphant in 1910, met with Father Murphy in the rectory, because Father Murphy had a reputation of being not only pro-miner, but pro with the silk mills. He was pro for the unions and the silk mills, because they were starting. There was a big silk mill in Oliphant at the time. Now it's an apartment house. It used to be Specialty Records. Okay, and that was the silk mill, the Oliphant silk mill. And there was Blakely had them and other places. Roosevelt came to Oliphant and he met with him, and then he also met with the educational leaders, because Oliphant had an education system that was above and beyond most. They had 14 schools, had over 3,200 people, 3,200 students, and they were only a town of about 10 or 12,000. And but they were big on education. One of the things about immigrants and the miners was education was the most important thing that you could get. Father Murphy, when he came to Oliphant, refused to build a church. They had an old church. He refused to build a new one. He said, no, we're going to build a school, because coal mining is not a finite industry. It will be gone. And now we have to educate our young and get them out into the world so they be prepared for the future. Progressive, looking forward people. And immigrants were progressive. They themselves wanted to move forward. They were denied education in the old country. They weren't allowed to have it. So when somebody comes along and says, we've got a public school system here that works, or a Catholic school system that works, and of course every ethnic group had their own Catholic school system, along with public school system. And they all took advantage of it. You know, one of the people that took advantage of it was my family. My mother's oldest sister was born in 1890, 91. She got her college degree in 1912. Okay, because they pushed education that big, that fast. A lot of people got their, now women were restricted to what they got. Of course, education, nursing, other fields like that. But there was, examples where others broke away. But it was always pushed on everybody. Education in the valley, whether it be in Carbondale, Archibald, Oliphant, Scranton, all the way down the line. Education for these people was important. They were forward-looking, and they understood that without it, they would end up back in the same place they were when they came to America. And they came to America not because the place over there was so good. They came because it was so bad. Okay? And this offered them an opportunity. And then what Mitchell did when he arrived on the scene was to grant them something they never had. The ability to have the dignity of a human being.
Bob, something about Johnny Mitchell. He was Protestant, but he was brought into the Catholic Church by our priest across the street, Father Tom Comerford. He is well known in the town. He brought him as a Catholic. Johnny Mitchell is buried at Cathedral Cemetery.
Right inside the gate.
Right inside the gate. That's Orem Street, I believe, in West Scranton. He was buried from the cathedral. He was the first lay person to lie in state at our cathedral church in Scranton. There is a monument in Scranton on the Adams Avenue side of the courthouse to John Mitchell. His statue is there, surrounded by the monument. And I brought an article in just 3 days ago in the Scranton newspaper. There's a picture of Johnny Mitchell. Just 3 days ago, page 3, in his monument. Over the monument is inscribed, "Champion of Labor, Defender of Human Rights." Johnny Mitchell. We brought another article in that in 1900, he got off the train and he was met, it says, by 3,000 people. Where they got that number, 3,000 people. They had a parade through the town, ended up at the Laurel Street ball field, it said. And that was 1900. He had a strike then, but he was just too exhausted to give a long speech. He was working so hard. But that was in our town, Johnny Mitchell, right down the street. And one more thing, we're honored tonight by having a relative of Johnny Mitchell here, Joan Holmes. Mrs. Holmes, would you want to tell us something about your relationship?
I'm really a relative of John Mitchell, but John Fallon was my great-grandfather, and he worked closely with John Mitchell. He was a national board member of the United Mine Workers. And when he died, John Mitchell was one of his pallbearers.
Bishop Holden gave the eulogy in the church mass for John Mitchell. And at the cemetery, John Kern, Father Kern, gave a little sermon in which he said he did not ask them for anything they could not afford to give, what the miners did not deserve. He was talking about the